I was first put in a detention facility when I was 13.
I was on probation at the time already because my mom put me on it, and so the school officer came, put me in handcuffs, and I was like, oh, crap.
The first time I was arrested was when I was 15.
Generally, young people who end up in the delinquency system, they are there because they've been exposed to multiple traumas.
LGBT youth could be facing rejection at home from their families, maybe being harassed at school because of their identity, or maybe they were picked up and profiled by the police because of who they are.
If we know about the reasons that youth are doing things, we could help. But for the most part, I think these youth are very invisible and are not talking about what happens.
Well, my grandmother raised me from the time I left the hospital until she passed away when I was 11, about to make 12. Moved to Atlanta with my mother. I stayed in trouble in school for not doing my work and not paying attention, talking back to the teachers. I had a fight with this guy in class for going around, telling people I was gay or what have you. I beat him up, and we both went to jail, but when they put the handcuffs on me, it was horrible. Once I got in the cell, I just didn't know what to do. I cried, I prayed, I beat on the walls, I wrote on the walls. What could I have done better to avoid that? But in all actuality, I didn't want to avoid it. I felt like I needed, to prove myself.
I coordinate a project for lesbian, gay, bisexual, and transgender youth who are in the juvenile justice system. The recent study found that around 15% of young people in detention were LGBT. We have a number of youth who come in on charges that stem from school. LGBT youth are more likely to, of course, experience harassment. As a result, either be truant and not go to school, or they may fight back. Keon had difficulty while he was in the detention center with the staff and the other young people that were detained with him. When he was released, he went right back to the same alternative school that he had been attending before he had been arrested. And he ended up just having additional difficulty, which kind of explains the sort of cycle that sometimes will happen with young people going through the system and then right back into the same conditions that sent them there to begin with.
A recent study from the Journal of Pediatrics, which is very groundbreaking, found that LGBT youth are being targeted for expulsion, suspension, and other types of school sanctions, as well as police arrest and detention at higher rates than young people who are not LGBT.
There are far more young people who are out in public and less closeted about their status. And because of that, I found that there's all kinds of institutional push against that. It becomes a challenge for the adults and the authority figures that have to deal with these young people.
There are a number of things that cause LGBT youth to be disproportionately represented in juvenile facilities. They are much more often charged with incidents in school. They are much more frequently arrested for sexual behavior that heterosexual youth are not arrested for, or because they are living on the street and they have to resort to crime.
First time that I found out about Santa Monica Boulevard, I actually came down this street. So that way I knew that I could make money that way. I didn't know what else to do. My biological dad was on drugs, and so he gave me up when I was like 5. And then I stood with my aunt and uncle, and they were super abusive, and I decided my freshman year in high school that I didn't want to live there anymore, so I ran away.
Family rejection for a teenager. It's a very significant trauma. And then to have to leave home because of that is even more traumatic.
Generally, folks say around 40% of homeless youth are LGBT. So knowing that LGBT youth are more likely to be rejected from their family, more likely to be on the streets and homeless, they're going to be more likely to turn to survival crimes.
I didn't have anywhere else to go, so I came out here. It was a tough decision, but it was the only solution I had to my problem. The first time I did it was on this street. Somebody kept cruising by. That was very scary for a 15-year-old. So, and it was a really old man. He took me to his house, which I had no idea where it was at. And it was the first time I did it. I cried the whole time during that.
The loneliness and the lack of self-esteem that stem from the poor relationships that they may have with their parents just leads to more out-of-home placements for these youth. And because of their being out of their family home, it kind of sets them up for problems later in life.
I got arrested for being a runaway. They put me in the tank for a couple days because I wouldn't tell them my name because I didn't want them to know who I was. So I didn't want them to send me back home. When it was time to see the judge, my aunt had the option to take me back, and she said no. She said, I don't want him, which I was very grateful for because there was no way I wanted to be back with her.
LGBT youth are more often detained by the court if a parent doesn't show up to take them home. And so they might have a misdemeanor like shoplifting charge for which youth would not normally be detained. But if their parent doesn't pick them up at the courthouse, then they will be held.
The mere fact that LGBTQ youth do not have a comfortable place to go home to really changes the whole dynamics of their stay in an out-of-home placement. Because it's not just a temporary placement for them, oftentimes it's just the beginning of their independence or their attempt at independence.
The first time I got into the juvenile justice system, I was 12 years old, and around that time, I had just began to understand and learn who I was as far as my identity and my gender and sexuality was concerned. And it brought a lot of problems in my home life, especially with my father, because he was very abusive. And he was not at all supportive of, the fact that I no longer, was his son, that I was his daughter. At home, I didn't feel like I was loved. At a very young age, I had problems in school, like being picked on and being bullied, and it got so bad to the point where I didn't want to go back to school. When the state found out that I no longer was going to school, they took custody of me from my parents.
Anytime you talk about taking a kid out of their home, you necessarily have to admit that you're going to do some harm to them. Now, maybe you have to do a balancing act and say, okay, well, based on the harm that they're already being exposed to and the potential for a greater harm, I think it's important that the court may see we have to remove the kid from the home. But you have to recognize that you're going to do harm to them.
Lily was referred into family court when she was young. She was placed in a group home, and the group home was not at all equipped to work with LGBT young people. Some of the staff, they did not intervene in fights that would happen.
There was an individual in the group home that I was at that used to particularly bully me more than everybody else. And so this person used to physically attack me. I had to fight them back. I was charged with simple battery. They put me into the juvenile justice system, and I became a ward of the state.
Once Lily was in the youth prison, she had a really difficult time. She was in an all-boys facility. She was experiencing the same things that all youth experience when they're removed from home and placed in a youth prison, only magnified because she identified as transgender.
In detention facility, there's a lot of safety concerns for young people who are LGBT. In particular for transgender youth, if a transgender girl is placed in a boys' detention facility, she's really at very high risk for physical and sexual abuse in the facility, but at the hands of her peers and also at the hands of facility staff. Recently, we heard of a problem where a transgender girl who was housed in an all-boys detention facility, she was forced to shower with the boys. And when she did, she got a ticket, a discipline ticket, for flashing her breasts in the shower. It's unfortunately not uncommon for staff to actually encourage abuse of a youth who's out.
The case that the ACLU of Hawaii brought was the first case of its kind ever in the country to challenge the conditions of confinement for children who are or who are perceived to be lesbian, gay, bisexual, and transgender. We brought the case on behalf of 3 individual kids. There was RG, who is a woman who identifies as a lesbian. There is CP, who is a male to female transgender girl. And there was JD, who was a boy that was perceived by staff and other wards to be gay. These kids were subjected to unchecked harassment, relentless abuse and discrimination, not only by the other wards, but by the staff themselves.
They would talk to these young kids about their religious views and telling these kids that being gay was wrong and a sin and it was against God and that they were going to hell. And this is, talking to kids who are religious themselves.
We got a very frantic call from a public defender that one of her kids, her clients, had been subjected to very serious physical assaults. This was a kid who had other wards pantomiming anal rape. He had semen rubbed in his face. And then when he wrote a complaint, the response was that they were going to put him in isolation. And they kept him isolated for 6 days. And never once did they address with any of the wards or the staff who had seen this happening that this was inappropriate behavior.
There was one particular officer who, when he was testifying, he was talking about one of the girls, RG, and he had been asked if she had been discriminated against or harassed as far as he had seen. And his answer with a completely straight face, and I think really genuinely, was, no, we have to get on her for that butchie action that goes on. But no, she hasn't been discriminated against or harassed. And I think that was also I think it was like that aha moment for everybody in the courtroom, including the judge.
Ultimately, what Judge Seabright ruled was that the state of Hawaii had failed its constitutional duty by failing to have any policies or procedures whatsoever that were addressed towards eliminating discrimination, abuse, and harassment. The state of Hawaii was the first state to have a policy specifically directed towards the treatment of lesbian, gay, bisexual, transgender kids. And we were fortunate because we have been able to serve as a role model for other states who started to look at their own juvenile justice populations and to ask whether this sort of rampant abuse was happening in their state.
Every child needs love. Every child needs nurturance. Every child needs to feel wanted. And when an LGBTQ youth doesn't feel that, ends up dropping out of school, feeling suicidal, getting arrested and then finding themselves in the criminal justice system. It's just a consequence of not being treated like a human being.
This is not about special treatment or special rights. It's about equal treatment. It's about ensuring that LGBT young people are safe.
We have been working with a number of facilities. Some of the short-term detention centers may actually be passing an LGBT policy in the future. We're hopeful for that.
When there is some kind of failure happening in the community, when their parents are not doing the job, when the school system is not doing the job, it is our obligation to care for these children.
I wanted somebody to love me, so to speak, and I wasn't going to get that from them.
I am who I am, regardless of orientation, race, or anything else. As a person and a human being, I have the right to date who I want. I have the right to do anything with my mind, my body, and my sexual orientation.
It's an issue that people need to be trained about. People need to understand that, you know, we're people too.